get this subcommittee started on SB 53, permitting the use of certain refrigerants that are in compliance with the Clean Air Act. As we get started, I'd just kind of like to throw out, I think there's a few things that we're looking for insight on, and we've got gentlemen here to speak to it this morning. One is whether or not there's any concern with the overall policy. Two, I'll be looking for some guidance on line 6, which says provided that any equipment containing such refrigerant shall be listed and installed in accordance with safety standards and use conditions imposed pursuant to such designation. Where are those safety standards coming from? Who's implementing them? Seems a little bit vague to me personally. But I would like to start the subcommittee meeting by welcoming Sean Toomey to just give some information on where the fire marshal is kind of sitting on this issue. Sorry to surprise you.
That's okay. Good morning, Sean Toomey,
morning.
State Fire Marshal. Thanks for having me here this morning. So I was, just for some background, we were asked for some fiscal note, asked about a fiscal note when this came through initially. We looked at it and initiated, it sort of said there was no fiscal impact that we saw. And then also that in our review, we didn't have any major concerns with the bill as was written at that time. And then I know last week I was at the National Fire Academy at a State Fire Marshal symposium that they held, and I know that you guys heard the bill, and some questions came up from we had concerns about it from the State Fire Code perspective. I think the only I would say generally probably not major concerns at all. Probably the only gist of that on the fire code side is the use of refrigerants. The newer refrigerants aren't totally addressed in the current code in our 2018 codes today, right? And I think you heard some testimony the other day. I listened to the hearing that the codes aren't going to catch up for a while, right? So on the fire code side, one thing that I thought we could do is in the NFPA 55, which talks about some of the refrigerant language. The 23 edition of NFPA 55 has the language on the fire code side to address it. So we could pull that in if we wanted to on the through the Board of Fire Control process, and then bring it forward for ratification to the General Court. The way the Board of Fire Control works is that we can actually enact it as soon as it's gone through the Board of Fire Control and just needs a ratification within a year. So if there was an imminent concern, we could probably get it addressed by June. Speaking with NFPA, the engineers down at NFPA, though, there's no major concern from what we could tell for refrigerants in quantities less than 10,000 pounds in non-protected structures, so typically non-sprinkled building. You start putting a sprinkler system in and other protections in buildings, you're talking 20 upwards of 40,000 pounds of the refrigerant products, which is huge numbers. So the advice that I was given through National Fire Protection Association NFPA is that there's really you shouldn't really have a major concern. And then they were quickly remind, which I'm very familiar with, that there's alternative means in the code that if someone were to present a new type of facility or a use that had in quantities in those large quantities, we can look at it and go ahead to the newer codes and the new guidance that's out there, and use that as, work with the developers to achieve any additional protection that's needed. So, that their refrigerants, so they're still flammable. There's ammonias and propanes and different things that are used for flammables, for refrigerants out there. But the newer, as I understand, all the research I've been able to do in the last week or so, especially, is that the newer refrigerants are a little bit less flammable than what, than what we're seeing out there now. So in my head, I think it's difficult to stand in the way of the clean air stuff. I think we have a couple different means and opportunities to get to where we need to if we're in those large quantities. The way that I understand the bill is written, we're some conversation came out, like our home refrigerators or air conditioner units. Those are very small quantities of refrigerant, and they have to meet listing standards, whether it's UL or FM or the other. There's a number of nationally recognized testing labs out there that list all of many of our appliances, whether it's computers or, the refrigerators or microwaves or different things like that, or surge protectors, for instance, right? So they need to meet those standards, as I understand it. And I think there's a gentleman here that knows the refrigerant side but I immersed myself in refrigerant in the last week. It's probably something I've not done in my over 20-year career in fire protection engineering work. But, I think the bottom line is that I feel pretty comfortable moving forward with it. Recognizing there's a federal need to move forward and help cleaner air and things like that. And I think we have means to address it. I think my ask is that if we sunset the bill for when we catch up and the stuff's in the code properly, right? So I think I can get stuff in the fire code probably by the end of the year. I think on the building code side, it's probably going to take a little bit longer, but we also have a means on the building code side too, and I'll let Phil Sherman as the chair of the Building Code Review Board speak, but there's a means there that they can get amendments in. So we could take those 24 language and pull it in sooner into the 2018 codes and get it ratified. So I've been babbling a bit, I think, but I think, I feel pretty comfortable with where we're at. I guess I reiterate, my ask would be is if we land on something like this now, is we just sunset it so that it allows time for the January 1st deadline for the federal standards on the clean air side for us to get caught up a little bit in our codes. I think that's really the crux of the problem. As I've talked to some of my counterparts across the country, is that we haven't had time to really catch up in the codes. Code officials tend to be very black and white. And if it's not explicitly written in the code, that sometimes we're reluctant to look at the newer technologies. So
Okay.
happy to try to answer
Great.
some questions.
Any questions from the subcommittee? Yeah, Representative True.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you say you're looking for it to be sunset, you mean the effective date? Is that what you?
No, I would think that we could put some language in, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but once we have the 24 edition of the code in place as our state building code, this section would go away, or would be repealed essentially. I don't know if that's the proper way to do it, or if we would catch it later, but I think one of the things in practice that's difficult is we've worked very hard over the last few years to have a state building code and a state fire code, and have a good process that the Building Code Review Board, the Board of Fire Controls do all their research and their homework and bring a package to the House and the Senate and say, this is what we feel is good for the state with the appropriate New Hampshire amendments, and we ratify it. And so we have the model codes, which are published nationally. We make some New Hampshire changes. We codify that in a rule. You ratify it, and anyone working within the state or out of the state can come and say, oh, this is a New Hampshire building code, this is a New Hampshire fire code, these are the New Hampshire amendments. We've also gone to the next step in some legislation recently that we are working very hard to put all the local amendments together too. So anyone comes in can say, state building code, state amendments. Oh, I want to work in Concord, here's the Concord amendments. And it's very clean. So I think when we hear the confusions when we bury some stuff in legislation and bury some stuff in the code amendment process, the design world finds it a little bit clunky, a little bit harder to follow. So the ask that we've been trying to do is, if we can, when we can, is any code amendment related stuff stays in the code amendment process. Does that make sense? Long answer.
Anybody else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming today.
Absolutely.
All right. Philip Sherman, Building Code Review Board. Just here, and then Representative Gerhard. Do you know if Tony's subcommittee is meeting today? No. 12th, I think. You're here just for fun.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've taken the liberty of just sort of putting my thoughts down. This may or may not turn into something formal. I find in my own mind that this is a little bit of a solution looking for a problem, in that in conversations with you, Representative Simon, it's not that anybody is trying to prohibit these, it's sort of just in case. So one, we have a sort of a board bias that we would prefer to keep administrative type rules on the code side, not written into law. We have 4 or 5 sections of 155A currently that deal with specific issues, and 50% of them are stale, out of date, and probably just need to be repealed. In other words, the codes, the model codes have caught up, they've dealt with them, no big problem. What I would like to propose is that we have a way to tag on the 2024 cycle of amendments. It's 20 pages long because they have to get into a bunch of different sections and different codes into our 2018 code amendment process. We have a hearing tomorrow with ED&A, Senate ED&A on, is it HB 564?
Yeah, or 541, 564.
564, to simply ratify. I think there's 8 amendments there that are working their way through the process. We can bring the 2024 amendments to our board second week of April, next week at our monthly meeting, have a public hearing second week of May at our normal monthly hearing, and then tag this on if we can get the ED&A and related folks to be able to deal with that then in June. Well, everything going according to plan, effectively, they'd come into effect around July 1st, with governor's signature. So that's my preferred route. If you really need to have a bill, I've taken the liberty of trying to mark up what's here now, and it may look like clarification, although as Fire Marshal Toomey indicates, these things have a bad habit of turning into black and white. So simply indicating that we use the term municipal building code amendments, that's just editorial, but then to clarify that these need to meet the New Hampshire State Fire and Building Codes. Referencing safety standards, and I'm not an expert on the federal regulations, but when I looked at it, it looked like there was a bit of a round robin where they say meet the local building codes, but if the local building codes don't have provisions, this bill would allow someone to essentially come in and not meet any standards. So there is a lack there until we get these amendments written into our code, which can happen, I think, relatively quickly. So that's my 2 options. Preferred, let us just do the amendment thing, give us some assistance, getting behind it. And then, I don't know if the proper word was sunset. I use the word kill, but you can put the right legal term on that. But if we need to keep this bill going, amend it so that it clearly requires compliance with the state codes and doesn't leave any gray areas there. So that's what I had to say about that.
Any questions from the subcommittee? Yes, Representative True. I can.
So are you saying that you don't see a need for this bill?
Not only don't I see a need for it, historically, when we write code language into state law, things get stale. At one day, there was a big discussion about why we had to have this code, specific code on log structures. Every model code in the country references that code now. It's just stale. There's no need for that legislation. What happens when a code goes into legislation is everybody's hands are tied. There's no appeals. There's no ability to work with existing conditions. There's no ability to deal with special conditions that the code didn't address. And local officials, all they can do is just say, that's the law, go do it.
So if I can just interject, because it was kind of my idea, Representative True, they'd really like to get the stuff into code, and we think we may have a way of doing it with 564. I talked with Senator Pearl this morning, who's the head of Senate ED&A. They have 564 coming before them tomorrow. And if we could amend 564 to add the code that's necessary to take care of this, we could have that done hopefully by June, which would meet our deadlines. I had just come up with the idea of potentially passing this with a sunset clause in it as kind of a stopgap between now and when they got that into code, but that when they did get it into code, this would just sunset and go away. So that it wasn't in statute, but it was in the building code, if that makes sense. Go ahead.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe the state fire marshal was saying, and I think you're saying the same thing. You don't like things to be in code in an RSA's because it
Right.
limits.
Correct.
Thank you.
Representative Schmidt?
Respectfully.
Okay, so the thing is, I'm very much in favor of the idea of having the people who are most knowledgeable and also to some degree most flexible, which would be the building code review board and so forth, the people who are most knowledgeable and most involved, to have them be the people where the rubber meets the road. I don't like locking things up in statute if you don't have to, because as the building code chair Sherman has just said, it locks you in a situation where you can't easily change it. You're stuck with it. So the question I have is whether this has been discussed with Chairman McGuire, because she is extremely knowledgeable from her professional background, but also from having been the chair or ranking member on this committee for years, and because she has that level of expertise and familiarity with all of this, I'd like to know that she's been consulted, conferred with, and that she's on board.
So the conversation that I have had with her, I haven't talked to her at length about this particular proposal of 564, but she was just concerned that there were concerns by the building code review board or the fire marshal with the actual refrigerants themselves, which there don't seem to be, and I think she's probably okay with that at this point. But as far as the overall scheme, we'll still run that past her before we move forward to see if she has any input into it for sure.
Well, I mean, the thing is, what the fire marshal was saying earlier in his testimony was that the concern that I voiced, and I wasn't the only one, with regard to the flammability issue, but to the degree that the flammability apparently is not really a problem with this. It's the current, the HFCs are somewhat flammable. I didn't know that, but then I have no technical background with all of this. But that the flammability issue is not an issue. It's not a concern in terms of going backwards. And Fire Marshal is saying that that we want to get in line with the incoming federal requirements and so forth, which are a move in the right direction for environmental concerns and so forth. So I think that my concern has gone away on that. And to the degree we have a better process, which I think is what Chairman Sherman is talking about, a better process overall, then as long as Carol McGuire is on board, I'm on board.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Schmidt, if I could just clarify, it's not that these are not flammable, that they're less flammable. The codes still have restrictions, especially as the fire marshal said, at larger quantities. And there are some very large refrigeration systems out there, universities, hospitals, industrial sites, and so forth. There are requirements that need to come into play here. And the gap with this bill is it's this round robin where the feds reference the state, but when you go to the state, there's nothing there yet. But the bill would say, go ahead and use this stuff. So that's the gap that we're trying to close. Thank you.
Now, our ultimate deadline for this was July of 24. Is that correct? All right. So we do have until July of 24. Are we going to have to overly rush the process to get it into code, to get it into 564? Or will it have a reasonable vetting process as far as the building code review board is concerned and our esteemed chair? Is she going to be comfortable with that speed of process?
By July of 2024, everything going according to plan, we should be on the 2021 codes, and we can easily wrap these amendments into that process, which we're in the cycle of now. What I'm proposing is that we can get that into the hopper for the 2018 code, which is already in effect in New Hampshire, and we've got some additional amendments working its way through the system with the hearing tomorrow.
Right. That was my question, though. As opposed to trying to get it connected to 564 and getting it into the 2018 code, is that going to be overly rushed? Because we have until 2024. If we were to pass something like this as a stopgap between now and when you finish the process, is it easier to give you the extra time to get the job done?
It's certainly easier, but I don't know as overly rushed. Everything gets overly rushed as the things come to a head
Sure.
at the end of the session, right? So,
Okay. Great. Yes, Representative Goley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question goes to, do we need to do anything regarding this in 564, or use what the vehicle we have in front of us that has already come forward with the changes made?
What was that again? Sorry.
Do we need to really worry about trying to get this into 564 versus using the vehicle we have here in front of us and taking care of the issue right here? Instead of,
Yeah, I mean, that would be the other issue would just be to hang on to this bill and attach the link. Well, yeah, because either way, you're going to end up in a committee or conference with it because it's going to be a separate.
well, if this is separate standalone, the Senate agrees, it won't be a committee conference. If
Sure.
it's agreed to, so.
If it's
that's
agreed
why
to.
I'm just suggesting it might be
Easier to do it that
leave
way.
this as a separate issue than putting it in.
Thoughts on that, Mr. Sherman?
one of the tasks that's in front of us is that because we're on the 2018 mechanical code and building code, the amendments are written by the model code folks against the 2021 code. So if we're going to put this in as an amendment to the 2018 code, we need to add in the changes that occurred at the model code level between 18 and 21 to then modify them essentially again with the proposed package. So the package is not written in a form that we can simply pick it up and reference it right now. Furthermore, the model codes, there are two fire codes. New Hampshire is on the NFPA code. There's also an International Code Council code. There are amendments to the International Fire Code, which does not apply in New Hampshire. And we need to work with the fire side to be sure that there isn't something there that needs to be patched up on the fire side, because both cycles of code deal with flammable refrigerants. They both have provisions for that.
You guys should both be sitting up.
Tag team it. We're
We
not
get along really
arm,
well.
arm
Both
wrestle.
fire protection engineers.
So I guess my concern is tagging to 564 because we know that it's already been through the full house. It's passed. It's nice and clean. It's been thought out, worked on for a while, and for building fire code stuff. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if it's exact tomorrow because it should be no issue at all. And I guess my concern is where there's so many questions about this. If we tag it into a very clean bill that will likely pass, I would be very concerned about losing all of our hard work on ratification of all those other building code amendments and fire code amendments, because those we've already established are good for New Hampshire. We need them. Like, they've already been vetted through. And I think if I understand the schedule right, you guys will know better than I am. But I think the Building Code Review Board meeting is June 9th, which is after some of the deadlines, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I had to go back and check the deadlines. If it was in May, I think we had plenty of time. But if we're stretched out to June, that might be a little late.
I'd love to try to stick with amending work within this bill if we can, rather than.
I don't say, yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
Representative Goley's point, and unless there's a problem with the Building Code Review Board, I'm not sure
No,
that I have a problem with that.
I just had another idea, forgive me. One way to do this would be amend it the way I indicate or something similar to clearly reference the state codes, but then make it effective July 1st of 2024. Because that would give us time to put it into the 2021 hopper, out it comes, and at that point, we'd have state code requirements. Again, I don't disagree with the potential to upset the apple cart with 564. It's simply that right now, there's no requirements. The code prohibits it. This would permit it, but it wouldn't apply any safety standards to it.
Jeff?
My question, I guess, goes back to listening to the fire marshal earlier. Couldn't this be taken care of in the codes as an amendment before 2024?
I can get it at the June Board of Fire Control and bring in an NFPA 855, and the research that I did, NFPA 855, I'm sorry, wrong one, NFPA 55, the language in there matches the language in the ICC language, and I looked at maybe one of these guys a little bit. They've been in the weeds of this far longer than I have, but I think that path, I mean, the Board of Fire Control will get that specific section put into place in their June meeting, and then it would be in effect. And then you guys, we would ask for your ratification within the ratification bill for next session. And that would cover it. We'd be well before the January 1st deadline that the Clean Air Act stuff needs to meet, and it would be in the fire code. There would be a gap on the building code side but typically in the statute, the stricter one typically applies. So I think we have some protection. The other ask, I don't know if the gentleman behind me can answer it, but what I was told by a couple of engineers on the NFPA side and the ICC side is that when they surveyed the country, that the number of people that would have these quantities we wouldn't be even tripping against some of these thresholds that are there. I mean, we have to put them in place just in case a large manufacturing facility or large facilities go into play. But I think that I don't know. I think it's almost, to me, it's a little bit of the fear of the unknown, right? That we're kind of a lot of the what ifs, but I guess I'm putting a little bit of trust in. I think the process that a couple of experts that I talked to have said that we have good paths to go there. I agree with that through the alternative design process. If something came in tomorrow, I feel pretty comfortable that we could address it. And I don't know. I'm starting to babble a little bit. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think the other thing that hasn't come into the conversation yet that is part of the conversation is industry and industry's concerns that there's just something in place that ensures them that they can move forward and continue to produce while we're working out all the details. And I'm just reminded by the nodding heads in the background that that's one of the concerns. So I guess personally, I'm still maybe inclined to say if we put something into statute with a sunset clause for now, so that there's something in place, give you guys the next year to work out all of the building code stuff, bring it back to us in legislation next year for consideration, as far as adjusting it to meet these standards. We can get the codes in place before June of next year, 2024. And then this would just sunset and disappear, and then we would just have the codes the way that we want it. I still think maybe the best route to go for now, because these things aren't going to start pumping into the state before then anyway, correct? Are they necessarily? You can't sell. Right, but there's no need for it before then, correct? Well, actually, sorry guys, if we could switch real quick, I'm gonna
Okay.
bring him up.
All three of us need to be.
Well, we could throw him on a mic on the side as well if we needed to.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Nerozzi. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for AHRI. We represent all the manufacturers of HVAC, refrigeration, and water heating equipment in North America. We produce about 90% of all of the equipment that both commercial and residential here in the U.S. The biggest thing for us right now is certainty. So as the chairman mentioned, July 1, 2024 is when the EPA is going to begin phasing down the use of hydrofluorocarbons immediately by restricting the existing supply by 40%. The reason why we can't wait till July 2024 is because our manufacturers have, supply chain, they need to get things figured out ahead of time. They can't just in 1 month all of a sudden divert equipment that's now suddenly approved in New Hampshire. There could be scarcity problems, and it may take a while to reallocate resources around. We really just would, this legislation, as I think others had mentioned, Representative Goley, it's very straightforward. We are fine with a sunset if that's, we don't oppose that at all if it's tied to when the new 2024 codes are adopted. But at the end of the day, being asked to, we've been working on this across the entire country, right? So in many states, we've been asked to just trust the process with the code process, right? I'll give you an example. In Georgia, we've submitted 4 different proposals to adopt these codes in Georgia, and all 4 were rejected. And a lot of it comes from that, well, we're on 2018 and that's 2024. We're getting way too ahead of ourselves. It's like, well, wait, this is a special situation where the federal government is mandating that we move to these new refrigerants, and we don't have time to to sit and go through the building code process. It's extremely, as the gentleman said, I mean, if everything goes according to plan. I mean, I've seen the plan go out the window. I've been working on this for 6 months now. The plan almost always goes out the window because then somebody else is introduced into the process. They say, well, wait a second, I got a question on this. And it just gets even more messy. So
A quick question though, for clarification, and I think this is the main thing that we're trying to sort out. If we were to pass a piece of legislation like the legislation that's sitting before us, we could start selling that refrigerant, unless it's effective in the future, immediately without the code in place. Correct?
Yes.
Right. So I think that that's the main concern that everybody's trying to balance, is getting something in place so that you have the assurance that you need, that you are going to be able to sell, and that, you know, but what's the best timetable that we can take to make sure that all of the boxes are checked, so that when we start selling, we also have the code in place to facilitate that.
Yes, I understand that. Sure.
Okay. So that makes sense though. So yes, Representative Gerhard.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just curious as to, well, I'm a little concerned about us tying ourselves this strongly to the federal government. So we have to now follow everything that they say is fine, we say is fine. We don't have any kind of say-so
Well, I think
down the road.
I think it's more so that the federal government is just restricting the production of certain refrigerants that we use. So we're not going to be able to get them because people aren't going to be able to make them. So this,
But it's also, okay,
yeah. So this is basically allowing us and producing the code to facilitate
okay.
the new refrigerants.
So just as far as the efforts that have, oh wait,
So yes, this
hold on. So as far as the states that have failed in Kentucky, Georgia, Virginia, Idaho, why is that failed? Is this just simply bad bureaucrats at work?
well, Kentucky, quite honestly, it was very frustrating. It was, I would say, more political than anything else. I mean, the legislation was moving unanimously, and we ended up. They have a very short session, only a 30-day session. We ended up getting hung up in the Senate on the very last 11th hour of the session, and unfortunately, we couldn't get it across in time. And so now, as a fallback, we're going to have to work with the department to try to find some sort of emergency provision or some sort of administrative process in which we can get this into effect. And I think everybody was pretty disappointed in Kentucky with the outcome. I think the legislative leadership, as well as now the governor's office, having to now, instead of having a clean bill that could have just, now we've got to revert back to trying to find something that fits into the hole that we can get a stopgap measure until they can get it next session.
But they're not overly concerned about it.
They're-
Let it fail. So I mean, they knew it was going to fail. What was their concern? And that's what I'm trying to get at. What is the issue? Is it simply people aren't meeting deadlines? It's just hard to believe it's happening in that many states. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no. So a couple of states are unique, right? So Virginia, we went through the normal code process cycle. Our proposals were adopted. That's why it's in orange, because we didn't pursue legislation there. In Georgia, same thing. We've had our codes approved by their DCA, Department of Community Affairs, and so that's why we have that in orange as well.
All right,
Idaho.
I appreciate it. I don't want to go through either. I appreciate it. I'm just curious as to why people would be opposed to this. That's what I'm just.
But
trying to-
there's really, it's not, there's no opposition. There's no formal opposition that I've encountered, and across all the states, 27 states I've been working in. It's just a matter of, again, it's a mismatch in timing. That's all it is, between the federal phase down and the building code cycle.
Yeah, it could easily happen here if we get bogged down in working between the Senate or here, and timing doesn't work out, or something happens, and then it just doesn't get done, and then we're orange on the on the chart,
Or red. You don't want to be
or
red.
red. Yeah. Oh, Let's
Well,
not
maybe
go
you do.
straight.
Yeah, I mean,
no.
but
But yeah,
I was just going to say, Mr. Chair, I mean, I'm from Pennsylvania. I worked for our legislature for a number of years. We were able to get that into statute last year, worked with our building code officials. They were fine with it. We really have not had much, any pushback at all from building code officials once we fully explain sort of, again, this mismatch between the two. And the building code process, again, is so unpredictable. In many of these states, some we've submitted 6 proposals already, and they've all been rejected because, well, we're not working on that right now. We're working on this. And it's, we would be fine if this legislation would pass clean. And if, obviously that'd be our preferred route, but if it would want to be tied with a sunset to when the 2024 ICC model codes are adopted, we have no problem with that. We have actually done that in 1 or 2 other states. In fact, in Pennsylvania is what we actually did that as well.
okay. Yes, Mr. Sherman, come on back up.
I'm dreaming on my feet, but I may have a solution that fixes everybody's needs. So ASHRAE, which is the American Society of Heating and Refrigeration, or
If you wouldn't mind, just a little closer to the mic.
sorry. ASHRAE is another model code group which feeds into the mechanical code. They have 2 standards on refrigeration, 15 and 34. Both of those standards were updated in the 2022 cycle. I believe that they probably address the issues that now will be reflected in the 2024 mechanical code. One way to get out of this would be to refer to ASHRAE 15-2022 and ASHRAE 34-2022 in the legislation, and then sunset the bill when the state codes catch up to it.
So we're not referring back to state code. We're referring back to,
We just give them the
ASHRAE.
model code. It's a clean version because they're already published according to a quick Google search. Unfortunately, these folks ought to look at that and be sure that gets them what they want, and they can't do that during the meeting here, so.
well, we don't have to do anything today on this, obviously, but, it's good to keep we've got a little bit of time to get it through.
So perhaps they could,
Because we won't be holding an exec session for a couple weeks anyway, so we've got a little bit of time.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly appreciate the suggestion and understand the ASHRAE standards. They have been updated to reflect the safety standards needed for these new classes of refrigerants. In other states, we've been proposed the opposite. They don't want to tie it to specific ASHRAE standards, especially if they're tied to a particular year or version of the ASHRAE standard, because then that becomes obsolete. Next time it's updated, you're already on a different version of that ASHRAE standard.
I think the point there, though, is it's the temporary stop measure until the New Hampshire code can get caught up. Back to my initial point, the concern is just passing something with nothing in reference, nothing that we can go to. And so then we're talking about trying to slow down this particular bill until the building code can move forward at the same time. I think what he's suggesting is that would be your stopgap. We can attach that to the present legislation, get that through, get that done so you guys can start working, and then next year come back with the building code to replace the ASHRAE standards, and then we just get rid of the ASHRAE standards.
Okay, so Mr. Chair, just to make sure I'm understanding, so it would be that this legislation would be amended to include references to the ASHRAE standards,
Correct.
and it also include a sunset provision tied to the 2024. That's the proposal that's out
Building
there now.
codes being adopted. Yes.
I will have to obviously I have people that I report to too, but that sounds logical to me. I would just have to. I can't make a commitment right now at this moment, but I can get on the phone here after the meeting, and
We'll be meeting again
Yeah.
before it goes back to the full committee, I'm
Yeah,
sure, on this. So
we have no interest in amending state building codes. We don't want to be in the business of doing that. This is just a unique situation that we're trying to get out front of and help New Hampshire prepare for it as well. So
right. Any questions? Oh, yeah, Jeff.
Just so for clarification, there's basically 2 proposals that I think both sides could come to an agreement that we may have to choose between, using the 2022 standards or using the amendment that was brought here before us. I think would address either way the issue, provided that the 2022 standards of ASHRAE have what you're looking for refrigerants. Is that what I'm
I think
seeing?
so. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I think that's actually, so the point on the ASHRAE standards is more towards the safety aspect. So that way there's, if you were to enact this in statute and specifically reference the ASHRAE codes, there would at least be some interim safety guidance until that was formalized in the 2024 code process.
right.
So the ASHRAE is more standard, referencing ASHRAE standard to be more for the safety aspect. And then the other language saying basically that you can't prohibit an EPA approved refrigerant in the state of New Hampshire is where that blanket allowance that certainty that we're looking for. Because we can't, one thing we talked about out in the hallway when we just met out there was, local governments being more restrictive than the state, and that just puts together a regulatory framework in which it's hard to do business when there's some refrigerants allowed in this municipality or county, some in this. So we want that blanket certainty that they're approved in the state, and if that means tying it to a sunset and an ASHRAE safety standard as interim safety guidance, then I would think that would work.
Yeah, I think the overall goal is just to make sure that you guys can continue to work, right? You can continue to produce, we can continue to sell, we can continue to do all that stuff. So as long as the solution provides for that and you have assurances that it's that's in place, I would assume that would meet your concerns. And then we just need to make sure that we have a vehicle to get the code changes into the building code in the long term, because that's where ultimately we want the solution. We want the solution in code. We don't want it in statute. So some vehicle out of the ones that have been kind of batted around today, we'll have to come to an agreement on which one we think is the best vehicle for moving forward. And hopefully we can get the job done and meet everybody's concerns at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Anything else from you, or?
I'm happy to take any questions, but we're talking to anybody after the meeting adjourns.
Okay. Yeah, I think seems like everybody's good. Thank you. Appreciate
Okay.
that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any comments from the committee, just as a mode of discussion for what we've talked about? Concerns with any of the proposed ideas or?
Let's get some of this stuff down in writing so that we've got something to look at.
Yep.
The Building Code Review Board is meeting tomorrow, so we'll have some feedback. What?
Was there somebody else who wanted to speak? Come on up.
For the record, my name is Bob Clegg. I wrote the Building Code Review Board statute when I was here. I served as its chair. And I would ask you not to tie that temporarily to an ASHRAE or anything else, because there's no guarantee that ASHRAE standard's not going to change. And there's no guarantee that we're going to adopt the building codes of 2024. In fact, we're having a problem right now adopting, or we're going to have a problem adopting what they're proposing. But the problem we do have that we need to fix is the idea that something new is coming along and we can't use it on the outside unless the legislature says we can. We can't wait 2 years. For the record, I'm a developer. I build a lot of big buildings. I build a lot of workforce housing. And every time somebody comes up with something new, we want to use it. But if I use it, I know I take the responsibility if something goes wrong, especially since it hasn't been approved by the Building Code Review Board. But if we keep stymieing everything, what's going to happen in the city, in the state, is that we're going to have to buy the old equipment. We're going to have to pay more for that refrigerant that's not available, because the companies are going to change based on what the environmental standards are. So I'm asking, if you're going to do anything, pass it so we can use it. We know that when we buy that equipment with that refrigerant in it, it's our problem. No matter what happens, it's our problem. But if you want to do something, sunset it in 2 years that allows you to re-up it, but not attached to any code that may not be reasonable enough for everybody in the industry to adopt. So it's important what you're doing here, I understand, but it's also important that it's not tied to anything else. It's a decision by the legislature. Building Code Review Board used to have all the responsibility to review them anyways, and I think that's more reasonable. I'm a developer, like I said. If I buy one of those machines with that refrigerant in it and something goes wrong, it's my problem. And I think that's the way we should approach it. I'll tell you that I was the first one to use 32-foot ply lamps, was what we called them in the day, for a roof. And the code said I couldn't because there was no code that said I could. So it took me months to find somebody who said, we'll let you use it, but sign here. If the roof collapses, you're responsible. I signed it, and that house is 28 years old today, and there's no problem. So if you let us in the industry figure out what it is we need and what it is we'll use, it'll make it a lot easier for those who aren't in the industry to understand. I'll take any questions.
And we don't want to wind up like in Kentucky, where they've hamstrung themselves and they can't do anything.
Yeah.
So
It doesn't.
let's get some of the stuff in writing so we can look at it.
Yeah, yeah, and it doesn't seem like anybody wants that to happen. Obviously, I think everybody seems like they want to make sure that we can innovate and work with the latest stuff. What was your concern, though, about adopting the ASHRAE standards temporarily?
If you adopt anything and you reference a standard in the codes or in what you do, and that standard changes, so does what you did. So in all the years I spent in the legislature, we tried not to use something by reference. If there's something in the ASHRAE code you want to use, put it in. But don't say ASHRAE 15, because if tomorrow somebody makes a change to it, now we're bound by that because the legislature said just that number. Oh,
Thank you, Chair. Couldn't you simply, not that I really don't have a position on any of this stuff. I think it's just, less government better. But couldn't you just cite that particular code? Though they have different editions, like when we get amendments to 0001H, can't you just say this ASHRAE at this point? Because you can't have a floating.
You could try to say in effect as of this date,
Yeah.
but you would have to call and make sure the day you adopt it, it didn't change in the meantime. I mean,
All right.
it is an
Makes sense.
ongoing
Yeah,
issue.
no, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
So, all right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for testifying. Appreciate that for your input. Mr. Sherman, did you have something you wanted to add? No, we're good. All right. I'm going to close up the work session for this time then. We can continue the conversation. We'll get some stuff done on writing so that we can consider some different options. And then we'll call another meeting and hopefully finish this up and be able to push something to exec. Does that make sense? Yeah. Representative True.
The old guy. I sort of like the discussion that we don't even need this. So
Well, we won't need it once it's in code. So,
right.
yeah.
And that they're working on code, they're working the building, then fire marshal, they're working on the codes, so they will meet it. Whether we pass this or not, that's their job.
The question is when it becomes effective. So, how long will it take to get the code produced, passed? Can we be assured that they will pass? And those are the questions that are kind of up in the air. So if for some reason the code doesn't pass and we don't pass something like this, then we can't buy those refrigerants.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? All right. I'm closing up the work session then. Thank you.